Ready for action. Right. Of course. Orders. Say the word. Yes, my liege. Say the word. Aye, my lord. On my way. What do you need? On my way. Yes. Let me at 'em. Right. Orders. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Say the word. Orders? Of course. Right. On my way. What do you need? Right. Aye, my lord.
Insufficient gold.
Say the word. Of course. Orders? Yes, my liege. What do you need? Orders? On my way. What do you need? Yes, my liege. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Say the word. Of course. Right. Yes, my liege. Orders? What do you need? Of course. Aye, my lord. Say the word. Say the word. On my way. Orders? Yes, my liege. What do you need? Yes, my liege. Say the word. Of course. Orders? Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Attack! Right. Of course. To arms! Aye, my lord. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. What do you need? Aye, my lord. What do you need? Say the word. Of course. Yes, my liege. Orders? What do you need? Right. Say the word. On my way. Orders? On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Let me out. Of course. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. What do you need? Orders? Say the word. Yes, my liege. Say the word. Of course. Right. Yes, my liege. Orders? Right. What do you need? What do you need? Yes, my liege. Say the word. Attack! Orders? What do you need? On my way. Of course. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. To arms! On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Orders. Right. On my way. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Of course. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Attack! Right. Let me out! Dwarf! Let me out!
Our champion has fallen.
Ready for action. Yes, my liege. What do you need? Orders? Say the word. Yes, my liege. What do you need? Orders? Say the word. What do you need? Say the word. Orders? Yes, my liege. Yes, my liege. What do you need? Say the word. Aye, my lord. Orders? Right. Say the word. What do you need? On my way. Yes, my liege. Of course. Aye, my lord. Of course. Attack! Orders? Right. Yes, my liege. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Orders? Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Of course. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Right. To arms! Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Say the word. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Say the word. Right. What do you need? Orders? What do you need? Yes, my liege. Of course. Orders? I'm in order. Of course. Right. On my way. Of course. On my way. Right. Say the word. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Orders? On my way. Right. Attack! On my way. Let me at him. Aye, my lord. Right. Attack! Of course. Of course. You need. Right. On my way. Say the word. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Of course. Yes, my liege. Orders? Yes, my liege. Right. Aye, my lord. What do you need? On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Oh, to arms! Right. On my way. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. Of course. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Right. Orders. Right. On my way. Yes, my liege. Say the word. Say the word. Of course. What do you need? Yes, my liege. Orders? Say the word. Aye, my lord. Let me at him. Orders? What do you need? My liege. Aye, my lord. Right. Say the word. On my way. Of course. Orders. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Let me at him. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. Whoa! On my way. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Yes, my liege. Say the word. Orders? Yes, my liege. Right. Attack! Aye, my lord. Orders? On my way. What do you need? Of course. Of course. Say the word. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. On my way. Right. Say the word. What do you need? Of course. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Yes, my liege. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Say the word. Right. What do you need? Orders? Of course. What do you need? Yes, my liege. Orders? On my way. Of course. Say the word. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. On my way. You need? Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Orders? On my way. Aye, my lord. Attack! Of course. On my way. Right. Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Say the word. On my way. Of course. Yes, my liege. Yes, my liege. Right. Orders? What do you need? Say the word. Say the word. What do you need? Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Orders? On my way. Say the word. Of course. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Orders? On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. Let me at 'em. You need? Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Yes, my liege. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. To arms! Aye, my lord. On my way. Let me at 'em. Attack! Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Yes, my liege. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord.
Our champion has fallen.
Ready for action. Orders? On my way. Of course. You need. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Orders? On my way. Say the word. Yes, my liege. What do you need? Right. Say the word. Orders? Yes, my liege. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. Right. Say the word. Of course. Yes, my liege. On my way. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. What do you need? Orders? Of course. Right. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right.
Our champion has fallen.
Ready for a yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. What do you need? On my way. Of course. Orders? On my way. To arms! Say the word. Say the word. You need.
More
Orders?
lumber is required.
Yes, my liege. Yes, my liege. Right. Say the word. Of course. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Of course. On my way. Right. On my way. Attack! Orders. What do you need? Say the word. Right. Of course. Yes, my liege. Orders? Aye, my lord. On my way. Yes, my liege. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Orders? Say the word. Of course. Right. Say the word. Yes, my liege. Of course. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Orders? Yes, my liege. Say the word. On my way. Aye, my lord. Orders? What do you need? Right. Say the word. On my way. Yes, my liege. Right. Aye, my lord. Let me out. Orders. You need. Yes, my liege. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. What do you need? On my way. Orders? Aye, my lord. What do you need? Right. Yes, my liege. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Say the word. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Right. Orders? Yes, my liege. Say the word. Of course. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Let me out. Right. On my way. Of course. You need attack. Aye, my lord. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Yes, my liege. Right. Orders? Orders? What? Of course. You need to say the word. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. Orders. Say the word. Yes, my liege. Of course. On my way. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Right. Orders. Aye, my lord. Let me out! Yes, my liege. On my way. Right. Of course. Say the word. Of course. What do you need? On my way. Yes, my liege. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Orders. Say the word. Yes, my liege. What do you need? Say the word. What do you need? Yes, my liege. Say the word. Orders? Of course. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Right, right. Say the word. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. On my way. Oh, right, right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Attack! What do you need? On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Let me at him. Right. Say the word. Yes, my liege. What do you need? Yes, my liege. On my way. Say the word. Yes, my liege. Attack! Let me at him. Aye, my lord. On my way. Attack! do you need? On my way. Yes, my liege. Orders? Of course. Yes, my liege. What do you need? Say the word. Aye, my lord. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Orders? What do you need? Yes, my liege. Right. Of course. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Orders? Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Attack! Say the word. Right. Right. Of course. What do you need? On my way. Aye, my lord. Say the word. You need? On my way. Yes. Orders. Say the word. Right. Aye. Right. On my way. Of course. Of course. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Say the word. Orders? Of course. What do you need? On my way. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Say the word. What do you need? Yes, my liege. Right. Orders? Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Yes, my liege. Of course. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Right. Aye, my lord. Say the word. Of course. Yes, my liege. Attack! You need. On my way. Right. On my way. Orders? my way. Aye, my lord. Let me out. Right. Aye, my lord. Attack! Right. Of course. On my way. What do you need? Of course. Yes, my lord.
You again? Delicious. Cunning.
Say the word. Aye. On my way. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Orders? Say the word. Right. What do you need? Orders? Yes, my liege. Of course. What do you need? Aye, my lord. To arms! Right. To arms! Yes, my liege. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Let me at him. Of course. Say the word. Right. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Of course. Of course. On my way. Right. For Lordaeron! Attack! Aye, my lord. Right. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. What do you need? Of course. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. Right. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Say the word. Of course. Aye, my lord. Attack! Right. What do you need? On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Say the word. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Orders? Yes, my liege. What do you need? Orders? Right. Aye, my lord. Say the word. Right. On my way. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Orders? Yes, my liege. Of course. You need. Right. On my way. Say the word. Say the word. Of course. To arms! Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. Of course. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Right. Of course. Let me at 'em. On my way. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Right. Here's my liege. Of course. What do you need? On my way. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Right. What do you need? On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Orders? Of course. Of course. On my way. Right. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Yes, my liege. Say the word. What do you need? Right. Orders? Orders? Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. Let me at 'em. Say the word. Aye, my lord. On my way. Attack! For Lordaeron! Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. What do you need? To arms! What do you need? Right. Aye, my lord. Say the word. To arms! On my way. Yes, my liege. Right. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. Orders? Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Orders? Aye, my lord. Of course. Say the word. Yes, my liege. On my way. Say the word. Right. Right. Orders? On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Yes, my liege. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. You need? On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Of course. On my way.